Okay, hi everyone that's attending now. My name is Holly Hughes and I work for the Eastern Oklahoma Library System. And let me introduce our distinguished guest this evening. Mr. White he was an educator in the state of Oklahoma for more than 40 years. And he taught history at Connors State College. And he was named to the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot commissioned by Governor Frank Keating in 1997. He has also been promoted to the position of chairman of the Social Science Division of the college in 1990, making him the first African American to serve as a division chair at Connors. He was also very active in civic and professional affairs of various communities he has lived in, and he has also served as the sponsor of the Black Student Society of Connors State College. And he was also very nicely my board member at Warner Public Library for several years, and he was the board member for McIntosh County also. He has won many awards and written very many publications. Also, he was a consultant on Kari Barber's Struggle and Hope, the Oklahoma Black Towns documentary. So thank you for joining us, Mr. White, and we'll get started. So can you please tell us, when did the massacre start and when did it end?
All right, the actual massacre began May 31st, 1921, with the Black citizens of Tulsa going to the courthouse to prevent Dick Rowland from being lynched that night. And then the actual fighting occurred early that morning, June 1st, 1921, when Blacks and whites confronted each other for the second time at the beginning at the Frisco Railroad line in North Tulsa.
Okay, and so why was Mr. Rowland being possibly lynched? What was the reason that they were worried about him?
All right, so the incidents that began this was that, well, I'm gonna go all the way back. So the first thing, when the Civil War ended, the United States went into what was known as Reconstruction. The opponents of Reconstruction, that is the Democrat Party, labeled this period Black Reconstruction because what had happened was that the Southern states in general, led by Democrats who supported slavery, April 12th, 1861, the first shots were fired in Charleston, South Carolina, and this began the bloodiest war in United States history. And so now the war has been concluded in 1865, and the Republican Party, which elected its very first president, Abraham Lincoln, is in control of the House and the Senate, but they've lost by April 14th control of the executive branch. And what happened April 14th, 1865 was that John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, in order to show that this war was not solely based on ending slavery and to trick the South into laying down their arms, had made Andrew Johnson from the slave-holding Confederate state of Tennessee his vice president. And so now that Lincoln's been assassinated, a Southern wartime Democrat is the president of the United States. So the Republican Party has lost control of the executive branch, and they could possibly lose control of the Senate and the House as well. The reason for that is that there's only about a 15-seat difference between the Republicans having control of both houses. Now, the Constitution of the United States, in order to appease the slave owners in the South, they wrote into the United States Constitution what was known as the 3/5 clause, which said that a black person was only worth 3/5 of a white person. Well, now with the end of slavery and the passage of the 13th Amendment, it appears that now black people are 100% human beings. And that means that all 21-year-old males have the right to vote. And as I said, the southern states were in general controlled by the Democrat Party. And there's only a slim majority for the Republican Party in the House and the Senate. Therefore, if the Democrats can control the electoral process, then they can possibly regain control of not only the executive branch, but the legislative branch as well. Republicans were determined to not allow this to happen. This should be familiar to you today because of what happened January 6th. And indicating that Republicans were determined to maintain control of the executive branch to the point of bloodshed. So all these factors are coming into play here. So Black Reconstruction, what the Republican Party wanted to do is to completely rebuild the southern states based on the now so-called freedmen being allowed to vote. And it was clearly understood that the freedmen, the former slaves, they were not going to vote for the party of disunion, disloyalty, dishonesty, the Democrat Party. They're going to vote for the grand old party. And they still use that term GOP today. The grand old party, the party of the Union, Lincoln's party. Now, the vast majority of the people in almost all of these former slave states were slaves, now freedmen. And so, for example, some of the states had, like North Carolina, nearly 60% of the population was slave. Now they're freedmen. Who's going to win the elections? Republicans or Democrats? So this is the situation in the post-war period. The Republican Party knows that if they can control the southern states, then they can control the United States. And as I said, Lincoln was saying that this war was not a war to strictly end slavery, even though all evidence indicates this is a war to put an end to slavery. And so then the Republican Party is determined to maintain control of the government. Therefore, they're going to do everything that they can do to do so. And the Democrats are going to do all that they can to prevent this from happening. So Black Republican rule, this is what the opponents to this change call it. And so in these southern states, segregation laws are going to be strictly enhanced and enforced. Now, segregation was in every state of the United States. New York, Pennsylvania, Black people were segregated, but in the southern states, they're going to be greatly enhanced, and they're going to be enforced through new organizations such as the terrorists, domestic terrorists, night riders, who you can associate with today, the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters and other groups. And so it's clear what they were designed to do is to suppress the Black vote. Mm-hmm. So segregation. Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma, developed from what was known as Indian Territory. And so in the 1830s, Native Americans were forced from their homelands in the southeastern states onto the reservations in this land west of the Mississippi River, and it was referred to as Indian Territory. The 5 so-called civilized tribes were all slave owners. And so all 5 of these tribes joined the Confederacy in this war to preserve slavery, and they lost. Therefore, the federal government is going to punish them by taking territory away from them and their sovereignty. Now, eventually, by 1907, Indian Territory has been opened up to American settlement. The population has grown to a point that people who live in Indian Territory want a new state. And so in 1907, the very first law that they passed was a segregation law. And they segregated everything. The hospitals that you were born in were segregated. The schools that you attended were segregated. Even the graveyards that you were buried in were segregated. So this leads to what is happening in Indian Territory, is that we see all Black towns being formed like Redbird, Tallahassee, Rennesville, my hometown, Langston, in what was then known as Oklahoma Territory, Clearview, and probably the most famous next to Langston is Boley. However, in cities like Tulsa and Oklahoma City, we're going to see Blacks being segregated. And so in Oklahoma City, for example, Blacks were not allowed to live north of what is now I-40. In Tulsa, Blacks were denied the right to live anywhere but in a about 40 block area known as Greenwood. And because downtown, Blacks and whites had to live and work together, you see Booker T. Washington made his Atlantic Exposition speech, in which he said, just like the hand fits in a glove, this is the way Blacks and whites could work together. But in everything that was social, they could be completely separate, just like the fingers are separate on your hand. Therefore, Dick Rowland, some believe, was a boot black, shining shoes in the downtown area, and because of segregation, Blacks could not use the bathrooms that whites used. And so the Drexel building was one of the few places that Black employees working downtown could use the bathroom, and it was on the top floor. A young girl named Sarah Page, she was only 16 years old, and Dick Rowland was only about 19. Sarah Page was a elevator operator. Dick Rowland, they speculate, needed to use the bathroom. He gets in the elevator may have jerked, or the floors, when it stopped, it didn't stop on an even floor, and he tripped, reaches out to steady himself, and may have grabbed Sarah Page. She leaves the elevator screaming. Everybody knows who Dick Rowland is. And so he knows the extreme danger that he's in, because, as I said, the Ku Klux Klan is operating in Indian Territory. We've seen a woman and her child, Sarah Nelson, lynched in Okemah. So everyone is aware of the extreme danger that his life is in. As he's well known, the sheriff arrested, the city officials arrest him. He's being held in jail, and rumors are circulating. And remember that this time there are telephones, and people are using the telephones to call each other and say, what happened downtown? And if you are a red-blooded American man, are you going to allow this to go unpunished? And so the two major newspapers in Tulsa at that time was the Tulsa World and the Tulsa Tribune. And in the Tulsa Tribune was the afternoon paper, and in the Bulldog edition, it had an article, "To lynch a Negro tonight." Well, the Black community said that this is not going to happen. And so, as I said, it took a long ways to get to that point, but the post-Civil War period, tensions, segregation, this is ripe for this conflict to erupt. And so the Blacks are determined to prevent yet another lynching. And I might as well point out, this is in the post-First World War period. And the First World War peace struck the United States like an earthquake. It upset everything. And so Black First World War veterans were determined to have their first-class citizenship. Woodrow Wilson justified the United States going to Europe to fight that war by saying that they had to make the world safe for democracy. Black soldiers had a double mission. They wanted to show whites in the United States that they deserved first-class citizenship, that they were loyal Americans, and so they gallantly went to Europe, fought, and won the victory, but they returned to the United States, and many accounts of Black soldiers, veterans, were lynched in their uniforms. So we see in this post-First World War period what was known as the Red Summer of 1919. Racial violence in city after city. And so what occurred in Tulsa is following this pattern of whites determined to keep Blacks in their place and Blacks determined to not be circumscribed by segregation.
So when they went to the courthouse to prevent him from being lynched, how did we get to the point where it became so violent and such a big massacre? Because it seems to me like that would not necessarily go as violent as it obviously did.
All right, so as I said, Indian Territory before the Civil War was considered to be one of the most peaceful places west of the Mississippi River. But in the post-war period, it becomes one of the most violent. As I said, in the other southern states, the former slave masters are extremely upset that their former slaves are now in some of these states running the governments. For example, the first Black governor in the United States was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who was the lieutenant governor of the state of Louisiana. He's a Republican. And the Democrats referred to these people as being carpetbaggers. And so here is a former slave who is so politically astute that he orchestrates the impeachment, trial, conviction, and removal of the Democrat governor of Louisiana, which elevates him to the position of being governor. So this is what's going on in the southern states. These former slave masters are just horrified at the fact that their former slaves are getting out of their place, that they are becoming uppity, that they have the audacity to think that they're equal to them. And so another phenomenon that's occurring is that the Southern economy has been wrecked by the war. And the Southern economy was primarily based on agriculture. So we see farmers in the South moving westward towards California, but Indian Territory is a very prosperous area to be in because there's plenty of land, it's fertile land. And so we're seeing not only whites moving into this area, but also freedmen. And so the Exoduster movement, led by people like Pap Singleton and the founder of my hometown, Langston, E.P. McCabe. So blacks and white are moving into this area in large numbers. And that's why we're seeing by 1907, Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory are both ready for statehood. But the Republican Party is determined to not allow another Democrat state into the Union. And the president at this time was Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, and he said he surely wasn't going to let two Democrat states into the Union while he was president. So they forced them together into one. So political violence, economic competition, struggle over land, all of these things are coming together. Oklahoma was a violent area. And as I said, the Knights of the White Camellia, the Ku Klux Klan, the Jayhawkers, the Regulators, all of these organizations are designed to make Black people stay in their place. And so Oklahoma's a violent place in this period of time. And the state of Oklahoma was born in violence. Oklahomans are associated with violence. And so that day, that morning, May 31st, 1921, Tulsa was ready for something to erupt. Now, the thing is, we listen to accounts of conspiracies. And so one of the points that I haven't talked about is the fact that that 40 block area known as Greenwood was one of the most prosperous Black communities in the United States. Booker T. Washington labeled it Black Wall Street. So you all are familiar with the significance of Wall Street and the United States history. And so he's comparing that Greenwood area to the financial power center of the United States, but it's in a Black neighborhood. The Frisco Railroad that I talked about, Muskogee, where I assume most of you are living, you're familiar with Muskogee, and so they refer to it as being three rivers. And so if you have rivers, prosperity usually will follow in the 19th century. And then when you add railroads and rivers, that's almost a guarantee that your city is going to be prosperous. Well, the railroads were in the so-called Black section of Tulsa. And so some noticed that they were going to need more land for depots to expand the railroads in Tulsa. And so one of the conspiracies is that the city leaders in Tulsa, in order to get the property that they needed to expand their economic power, had to burn out the Black section. So some believe that that all these, I said, lynchings have already occurred in Tulsa. We've had tensions because of veterans returning and fighting over who's going to get what jobs, and tensions over land. And so it was ripe for something to occur. And so when this incident erupted, it didn't take much to set a pile of dry wood aflame. And so the Dick Rowland incident was just a spark. Now, to go even further into conspiracy, and I'm saying this is just conspiracy, this is nothing proven. Some believe that Dick Rowland and Sarah Page were quite familiar with each other. And some believe that Sarah Page may have been a woman of the streets, and Dick Rowland was her handler, and that they had been caught, and a deal was struck that they would foment this incident by claiming that she was being attacked by a black man. And so, as I said, and the fact that this situation of tension, economic, social, political tensions, could start such a event. It's clear that Tulsa was just ready for something to explode.
So when the event happened, the National Guard was called in at one point. So can you tell us what role they played, and did they assist or did they cause more problems?
Okay, so as I said, Dick Rowland has been arrested. He's in the city jail. The city jail cannot be defended. And so Dick Rowland was turned over to the county, and the jail was at the top of the courthouse. So it was going to take a tremendous effort for these lynchers to get to Dick Rowland. And so, as I said, the newspapers are whipping the Tulsa citizenry to a fever pitch. And rumors are circulating, and blacks are going down to the courthouse to offer their aid in preventing this lynching. And so there are around maybe 300 or 400 300 or 400 whites at the courthouse, and maybe about 50 to 60 black men armed go to Sheriff Gustavson and say, we're willing to aid you in defending the jail from these lynchers. He assures them that nothing's going to happen. They can't get in. Dick Rowland is safe. So they return to Greenwood, but by 10 o'clock that night, May 31st, reports are given in the black section of town that there are around 1,200 whites now milling around the courthouse. Well, 1,200 armed and angry lynchers against a handful of policemen, Dick Rowland is going to lose his life. So around 300 black men armed, and many of them veterans of the First World War, they go down and they are insisting this time that Sheriff Gustavson allow them to protect Dick Rowland. Once again, he rebuffs their calls, and one account is that a white man sees a former black veteran armed and says, "Boy, what you doing with that gun? Give it to me." And he replies that he'll be glad to give it to him unloaded. And so he tries to disarm this black veteran, and the black veteran unloaded the gun into the man trying to disarm it. And then other blacks began to fire, and other whites began to fire. And so the fight is on. And as I said, the blacks retreat back to the Frisco Railroad line, and they defend themselves. And so they hold off the mob at this point. Another controversy is the signal. So as I said, conspiracy. Some believe that this whole incident had been earlier planned, and so you should be. And history does not repeat itself. I tell my students all the time, it does not repeat itself. But the topics keep coming up over and over again. So right now, investigations of what happened January 6th. Was this planned ahead of time? And so there are a lot of people who are saying that they saw traffic on social media saying, come to Washington, D.C., bring your weapons. We're not going to take this. So that would sound like it was pre-planned. So as I said, but can you prove that? Or was this just a coincidence that former President Donald Trump makes a speech in front of a highly agitated, armed, and deadly group of people, and they just mistook his words and attacked the Capitol? So we have a situation that over 100 years, well, not over, on nearly 100 years ago, that was similar to this. And you can see how much harder it's going to be to try to determine what actually happened 100 years ago versus you see it on video right now and can't figure out, did these people plan this or was it spontaneous? But anyway, the fight is on, and so the blacks retreat into Greenwood and they're able to defend themselves. However, the whites retreat back into their section of Tulsa, and it's apparent that planning was devised. And so sporting goods stores are being broken in to, and arms and ammunition are being stolen. The city deputizes former lynch mob members to now go into the Greenwood area and disarm these blacks. And so, as I said, the controversy is the signal. So they waited until it was dawn where they could see. Some say that a siren was sounded. We don't know what the signal was, but a huge mob of now people determined not to lynch Dick Rowland. They've shifted their attention from Dick Rowland to now lynching Greenwood. And so any black person that they saw, they were going to disarm, murder, and then loot their property. As I said, this was one of the most prosperous areas in the United States for blacks. And so automobiles, jewelry, furs, whatever they could steal from these houses. And then once they looted the houses, then they set them on fire. This is going to occur all day, June 1st, 1921. Now, the night that the confrontation began, officials in Oklahoma City, the capital of the state of Oklahoma, are being made aware of this by officials in Tulsa. And so the governor at this time was a man named James Brooks Air Robinson, JBA Robinson. And so Robinson is letting the adjutant general of the National Guard be aware that something is happening in Tulsa. And so the way to get from Oklahoma City to Tulsa was by train. And so eventually that morning, the National Guard comes in from Oklahoma City. But Adjutant General Barrett, he does not deploy his troops immediately to disarm the deputized rioters versus the massacre victims. He stops feeds his troops, and then deploys his troops. And so this is what the National Guard was used for, and they were effective in disarming all of the blacks. Blacks that were disarmed, the males were generally separated from the women and children, and they were taken to two major sites, the fairgrounds in McNulty Park, and held as in detention. So the National Guard, they didn't add to the suffering of the riot, but they didn't prevent, and they did not ease the suffering in a timely manner.
So you said they were being detained at two locations. So when they were detained, I'm assuming a lot of the African Americans had jobs at the time. Were they just and not allowed to get out, or how was that handled?
Okay, that's another good point. So, and it's kind of going to the conspiracy. I'll start with that. Some of the conspiracy is that some accounts, and what I'm talking about is oral history. Black people passing these stories down to their children passing them down to their children. So we're talking about oral history here. So one of the things that many people came in with accounts of was that black maids that were favored were told, Hattie, it won't be good for you to go home tonight. You just stay here. So we had a lot of accounts of people saying that their grandmothers, great-grandmothers were warned, don't go home tonight. But so that gets to the employees. Now, your boss could go down to the McNulty Park. They had a tag that you had to wear, and so you put the tag on that said that you've been released to your boss. And so Greenwood has been burned to the ground, but business is business. These businessmen have to continue their businesses, and so they're going to go get their loyal and most trusted employees out of detention. And so this is what was done. So you could be released into the custody of someone who was trusted.
How many people did they estimate had died in the massacre?
Okay, this is one of the biggest controversies, and it continues to this very minute. When I was in college and began studying this, the first reports that I read said that only 26 black people had been killed and 6 whites. Well, a riot of this nature, and well, I'll come back to that. But a riot of this nature, that just seemed, that's impossible. And as I said, the summer of 1919, we had race riot after race riot after race riot. And so 26, 2 days of bloody fighting, and only 26. Now, I'm going to step aside for just a minute here, because the thing is, I prefer to not call it a massacre. And the reason is, I'll go to the Civil War. Fort Pillow, Tennessee. Old men, women, and children, slaves, were gathered into Fort Pillow, and a Confederate general named Nathan Bedford Forrest, Forrest City, Arkansas is named after him. The reason he's infamous today is because he's one of the men who met and formed the Ku Klux Klan. Nathan Bedford Forrest, and some of you might be more familiar with him because of the movie Forrest Gump. That's who Forrest Gump was named after, a founder of the Ku Klux Klan, an infamous millionaire, slave owner, Confederate general. So Nathan Bedford Forrest, they overrun Fort Pillow. Well, the normal thing to do is put up your hands and surrender. He did not allow this. They murdered all of these innocent men, women, and children. So that is a massacre. I told you this is where we are right now. This was formerly Indian territory. And so Wounded Knee, Washita, the Native Americans know massacre after massacre. Women and children unarmed are wiped out. The reason that I don't use the term massacre here is because Black men fought, defended their community. They were just outnumbered. And so it wasn't a massacre, they fought back. And so, and it's not a riot because some people try to say that, well, a riot is when you perpetrate these actions, such as what we saw January 6th. That's a riot. Now, if they had killed everybody in the House of Representatives and in the Senate who were assumed mainly disarmed and couldn't fight back, then that would have been a massacre. But you saw what rioting is, and it could have led to a massacre. So the reason I'm doing that is because, so Blacks and fought back, and when you have, and as I said, and say I'm of the Vietnam War era, some of the accounts of what happened in Vietnam indicate that enraged, they were just enraged when they went into battle with their opponents, that they fought to such ferocity that when you say 2 or 3 people got killed, that's just, no, it just can't be. So the earliest accounts was only 26 Blacks, maybe 6 whites were killed in this event. But the oral history says, oh no, many, many, many more people were killed than this. And that leads to another big controversy. I'm sure you're gonna ask a question about the weaponry that was used. But we had some of our worst fights during the Tulsa Race Riot Commission meetings over this number. And so me and some other more vociferous historians, we had to fight to get the number up to just 300. But we had accounts that where people saw wagon after wagon carrying loads of bodies to be disposed of someplace. And remember, this is June 1st, it's hot in Oklahoma. These bodies had to be quickly disposed of. And we have accounts of people downstream of the Arkansas River saying that they saw bodies floating in the Arkansas River. And so 26 would not account for these stories. So I would say at least 300 or more people were killed, and that's 300 Blacks, not including the number of whites who may have been killed. And one of the methods that they're trying to use is see who was admitted into the hospital. Blacks were not admitted into the hospitals, but if a large number of Blacks were killed, and you mathematically try to determine Well, if for every one white person that was killed, maybe 10 blacks were killed, then look at how many whites were admitted into the hospital and died as a result of wounds. You could see that number. So mathematics, I'm a historian. Math is not my thing, but I understand it. But at least 300, I would say, were killed.
You mentioned weapons. So what weapons were used in the situation in Tulsa?
Okay, so, well, I can't. Primary weapons were rifles, shotguns, but the unique weaponry that was used was a machine gun. Some of you are familiar with Tulsa, and you know where Greenwood is and the OSU Tulsa campus. Well, to the west of the OSU Tulsa campus, there's a huge hill, and there's a sign up there saying OSU. And so many accounts say that a machine gun, and kind of going back to the Civil War, the Gatling gun was perfected during the Civil War. And the repeating rifle was perfected during the Civil War. So a machine gun, they say, was set up on Standpipe Hill overlooking Greenwood and used to shoot down anybody black that was moving. So machine guns. The most controversial, I would say, is the airplanes. And so from what we understood, there were only 3 airplanes registered in Tulsa. And so the accounts are that somebody stole one of the Skelly Oil Company airplanes. They flew over Greenwood, and it says these are 2-seater biplanes. Remember, this is in the 1920s. And the person in the back seat of the airplane was shooting down on the residents of Black Wall Street, and they were also throwing dynamite bombs. And so this gives Tulsa the distinction of being the first city in United States history to ever be bombed from an aircraft. And so that's one of the most unique weapons, is the use of airplanes during this war.
After you were talking about the bodies and they had to get rid of them, so there has been now obviously a mass grave found. How many mass graves do they think would be in Tulsa, and what are the next steps now that they have found one of them?
All right, so we were told stories of young white people, young white males, just milling around as boys would do in the post riot period, and seeing piano boxes loaded with black bodies being quickly disposed of. And so Knobloch Park, Washington Cemetery, several sites we were told that there may be mass graves. And as you all are aware, one site was uncovered now, and so there are more that have not been examined in the same manner as what you saw this summer. But now that they found the site, what these forensic scientists can do, they can examine the remains of the people. There are still people who, and there are black people who know that the story has been passed down that they had relatives who just disappeared after the riot. Therefore, there are people who are still alive in Tulsa that DNA can be extracted from them, DNA can be extracted from these remains, that's what I'm told, and that they could then try to match it. They can look at the clothing that would match the period of time, the dental work that would match this period of time. There are a lot of things that can identify these people as being from the 1921 period. And when you have 12 or more people buried all together, and they're from this period of time, then it's not going to take too much to deduce that this could be race riot victims. One of the things that I do as a historian, especially here in Eastern Oklahoma, I walk the graveyards. Now, I'm not a ghoul. What I do is, because I do Civil War research. Around here, in fact, when I lived in Chakotah, I lived on a street called Cemetery, and it dead-ended right behind my property into the Native American cemetery. And when you walk through those cemeteries, you look at the headstones. You look at when the people were born and when they died. And one of the things I began to notice is that you'd see 8 or 9 headstones, and the people buried there were all male, and they all died the same day. Well, the only thing you can, in 1861, 1862, the only thing you can deduce from that is that, and I know the Civil War battles occurred all around us. We had 77 major battles fought in Indian Territory. The only thing I could deduce from this is that these men all died at the same day in the same Civil War battle. So you understand what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And so this is what we're going to do now, is that, but now we have to use DNA to try, and the clothing and dental work to try to figure out if these people all died in 1921 and they're buried together in a group like this in 1921, it has to be that they were race riot victims. It doesn't say that they were, but logic would indicate that that's the case.
Okay. So when they identify them, are they going to exhume them and then put them in an actual grave and mark the grave? Right. What is the plan?
So right now, from what I'm reading in the Tulsa World and hearing on the Tulsa television stations, is that they have 2 options going, and the anthropologists, I mean, not the anthropologists, but the people who are doing this are saying that they need to, I believe in just a few weeks, get permission to exhume these bodies, or they're going to be put off for another year. But they first have to get the permission to exhume the bodies and to examine them. Then, if they determine that they are race riot victims, are they going to put them back into the same grave, or give them a honorable burial someplace else in the graveyard? And so that's the controversy going on now, is that, and you can understand, in Indian Territory, we finally have a federal law that says that you cannot go in and rob the graves of Native Americans. That used to be a big trade in Oklahoma. But now you will get a very heavy federal prison sentence if you're caught doing that. And so the spiral mounds, for example, were just desecrated by people before these laws were passed. So we don't want to desecrate these burial places, but the thing is it desecration of a burial place when you were not with honor buried? For example, when in New York, they were about to build a new building in New York, and they uncovered obvious 17th century slave graveyard. Well, it wasn't that they just dug a big hole and dumped a bunch of black bodies into that grave unceremoniously. They were lovingly buried, and then if you dig them up, shouldn't you show the same honor, right? Mm-hmm. These bodies were not ceremonially, in fact, they passed the ordinance that no funerals could be held immediately following the race riot. So they were not given the honor and dignity that they should have received. Therefore, it's just my opinion, you would not be desecrating their memory by moving their bodies to another location and giving them an honorable funeral and burial.
We are going to ask if anyone who is listening, if they have a question for Mr. White, if you would please put it in the chat so that we can ask him that. And then we have a few more minutes left before we will go. So if you have a question, please type it in. So Mr. White, they have a question. Were any whites charged with any crime, or were only blacks charged? And what crimes were they charged?
Okay. As I said, the Redfern case, some people were charged for breaking into well, they weren't necessarily charged. What happened was that some of the lynchers and then rioters were breaking into places that had arms and ammunition. And the Redfern case came out because a gun store owner sued because his property had been taken and he wanted to be compensated. So as far as I understand, nobody was charged with a crime other than this owner trying to recover his property. Question of property. So ordinances, and so one of the heroes of this was Buck Colbert Franklin, who was one of the lawyers in Tulsa. Ordinances were passed that clearly showed that they did not want blacks to rebuild in the Greenwood area. And so wealthy black businessmen like O.W. Gurley, he was run out of town. They told him, you better not stay here. And so he just left everything he had, and that's it. So only a few blacks had the kind of resources to where they could quickly rebuild. And then the city makes it even more difficult by passing ordinances that you had to rebuild with certain type of materials, that you had to have a brick building and so forth. Whereas people needed to be living, the quickest way to move back into the area is just pitch a tent. So Franklin, John Hope Franklin's father, is bringing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. And as you know, just a few years ago, the Harvard law professor Ogletree, his case was thrown out. They said that the statute of limitations had run out, but our argument was that how could the statute of limitations run out when we tried to go into court and prove that these people were murdered at the hands of these people. This property was destroyed at the hands of these people, and everything was done to stop the cases from moving forward. but the Supreme Court ruled the statute of limitations had run out. And so this is the situation today, is that to this day, no one has been charged of these crimes. Now, some are saying that one of the reasons that some people are so determined to keep this a conspiracy of silence is because there is no statute of limitations on murder. And that is sort of like what happened in Osage County with the members of the Osage tribe who were murdered to get the head rights to be transferred so that their oil lands could be stolen. And so now that's coming out. More and more people are becoming aware of what happened there. And it went to the highest officials. The very first governor of the state of Oklahoma from Muskogee, Charles N. Haskell, was one of the lawyers involved in this. So as far as I know, nobody's been charged, definitely not tried or convicted of anything dealing related to this riot.
That is the only question that we got, but I definitely want to thank you for coming and talking to us and telling us about this history of Tulsa. It's sad and unfortunate, but it's definitely needed to be discussed. So I appreciate your knowledge, and at this point, we will tell everyone to have a good evening.
Okay, I appreciate you all inviting me to share what little bit I know, and I hope it has enlightened and that you will go out and do your own investigation and study of this, because it is a book that everyone should read. Is Mary Parrish's book. It is a very good account of what happened. It gives you the personal feeling of how people were feeling and thinking during this conflict.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Good evening.